The basement floor was freezing my bones, but the real cold was in my heart when I heard the key turn above. They think they locked up an old lady to steal her jewelry. What they don't know is that the very house they're standing in, the whole street they live on, every blade of grass belongs to me. That's not even the biggest secret. Down here, behind the furnace, something is beating, and it has the blue light of a government experiment. My son Michael and his viper wife Crystal didn't lock me in a prison. They locked me in the vault that's been hiding the truth for 20 years. And now, the ghost of their dead brother is coming down the stairs to finish the job. Who is coming for me? And what did they truly unleash when they slammed that door? Before we go to the full story, please tell me from where you are watching. Tell me in comments, like the video and subscribe for more videos. The air down here was thick with the smell of damp concrete and neglect. A sharp contrast to the lavender-scented, meticulously organized life I'd curated for Michael and Crystal upstairs. My breath plumed out in little white clouds, even through the cashmere shawl they'd let me keep. A small unintentional mercy they'd likely already forgotten. I settled onto an overturned milk crate, my knees protesting the sudden, harsh contact, and ran a hand over the rough-hewn cinderblock wall, my mind already racing, not with panic, but with a cold, clear strategy that had earned me my first million before Michael was out of kindergarten. It was my suspicion about this house, about this basement specifically, that had brought me here in the first place, long before their recent, abrupt disrespect turned into outright imprisonment. I hadn't come for a casual visit. I'd come to confirm a decade-old hunch, a small niggling detail that had been buried in the original subdivision schematics I'd reviewed countless times. When I gifted them this house in the exclusive Whispering Pines estates, a gift I could revoke with a single phone call, I'd purposely chosen this specific lot, not because it was the largest or the most expensive, but because of its peculiar subterranean history. I remembered the conversation with my head legal counsel, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose silence was worth more than gold, discussing the property's unique easement rights. Crystal, bless her manipulative heart, had been complaining about the draftiness of the main floor, unwittingly confirming my initial theory that the basement's ventilation system was tied to something far older and more substantial than a standard residential HVAC unit. Her little snide remarks about my old-fashioned habits, my insistence on checking the fuse box myself, all of it had been carefully noted and catalogued in the ledger of my mind. The betrayal didn't sting as much as the sheer stupidity of their actions, the lack of foresight, the blinding entitlement. They were playing a child's game of house arrest, with a woman who had played chess with billionaires and won. I took a deep, shaky breath, the cold air filling my lungs, and focused on the weak, flickering light bulb dangling precariously above. The light wasn't just old, it was connected to an entirely separate electrical grid, a system I'd personally paid to have installed, routing power to an underground facility that predated Whispering Pines by 70 years. They didn't know about the facility, or the secondary deed, or the original iron-wrought vault door hidden behind the water heater. But they had to have heard something, a strange hum in the pipes, a vibration in the floorboards. Their sudden aggression had to be driven by something more than just greed for my jewelry. It had to be fueled by a secret they thought I didn't know they knew. I strained my ears, listening for a sound that wasn't the frantic, shallow beating of my own heart. A sound I'd only heard once before, years ago, when the construction crews were breaking ground for the community pool. The distinct metallic clink of a heavy latch being thrown, a sound that came not from the basement door, but from the wall directly behind the furnace. The furnace hummed to life, a low industrial roar that momentarily drowned out the persistent buzzing of the old fluorescent fixture, and I shivered again, pulling the shawl tighter around my shoulders, feeling less like a prisoner and more like an undercover operative finally reaching the final, crucial stage of her mission. My mind flashed back to the day Michael told me he was moving into this subdivision. He'd called it a dream come true, oblivious to the fact that I held the dream's blueprints in my safe deposit box, along with the master deed, a thick stack of papers bearing my name, Amelia Dubois, right next to the stylized logo of the development company, Dubois & Sons, a company Michael believed was run by his deceased father's anonymous partners, never suspecting that I was the senior partner, the only partner, since the day his daddy's plane went down 20 years ago. The house was his, yes, but the land, the infrastructure, the entire planned community of Whispering Pines, the whole 200 acres of perfectly manicured lawns and identical McMansions, belonged to me. I had a feeling, a deep, unsettling intuition that had never failed me in business, that their sudden decision to lock me away was precipitated by a chance discovery, a piece of evidence too big to ignore. They weren't just locking up their mother. They were trying to silence the last person who knew the truth about the land. Maybe Crystal, with her insatiable appetite for rearranging and improving things, had stumbled upon the original plat map I had intentionally left in a hollowed-out dictionary on the bookshelf, knowing she would eventually find it. The map was drawn in a different era, marking this specific lot, Lot 42, not as a residential property, but as primary access point to subsurface utility grid Gamma. Utility grid Gamma was my private little secret, a network of high-speed fiber lines and backup generators that provided exclusive, untraceable power and communication to my offshore financial headquarters, hidden 20 feet beneath the community clubhouse's pristine tennis courts. If they found that map, they wouldn't see power lines. They'd see the word access, and their minds, already corrupted by greed, would jump to gold, to money, to something tangible. They wouldn't understand the complex, legal web of ownership, but they would certainly understand leverage. I shifted on the crate, the cold seeping into my core, and looked towards the north wall again. The clink was definitely there, followed by a faint grating sound, like metal dragging across concrete. It wasn't them coming back. It was someone or something moving inside the wall, on the other side of that secret vault door. And a new, more terrifying question emerged. Was I the intended victim of an opportunistic plot, or was I caught in the crossfire of a much larger, darker secret that even I, the owner of the land, hadn't fully uncovered? The metallic scraping intensified, a relentless sound that seemed to vibrate not just through the wall, but through the very fillings in my teeth, forcing me to clasp a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. I was no stranger to fear. I had stared down hostile takeover bids, survived anonymous death threats from disgruntled competitors, and negotiated deals in rooms where the air felt thick with pure malice. But this felt different. It was a deep, primordial sense of trespass, a feeling that I had opened a door and something monstrous had walked in. My son, Michael, and his viper of a wife, Crystal, were upstairs, likely celebrating their victory, with the bottle of Dom Perignon I'd bought for their anniversary, completely oblivious to the fact that their petty act of confinement might have just triggered a sequence of events far beyond their control, or mine. I remembered the odd, hurried conversation I'd overheard 2 days prior, a whispered argument in the kitchen that had been the catalyst for my sudden, unannounced arrival. Crystal's voice had been shrill, panicked. "You told me it was empty. You said she shut it down years ago, Michael, you promised." Michael's reply had been a low, guttural murmur I couldn't decipher, but the tone was pure dread. At the time, I assumed they were discussing an illicit affair or a crippling debt, the usual messy drama of young, entitled couples. Now, hearing that scraping noise, a horrifying possibility began to crystallize. They weren't worried about me finding a secret. They were worried about something in the basement being discovered, or perhaps being activated. The true betrayal wasn't the locking of the door. It was the realization that they might be knowingly living atop a ticking time bomb, and their only concern was that I, the one who truly owned the land and all its secrets, would expose them. I slid off the milk crate, wincing as my stiff joints screamed in protest, and moved silently toward the furnace, navigating the obstacle course of forgotten childhood toys and boxes marked Christmas decorations. "Do not open." I had to get a better look at the wall. I had to confirm if the small, barely visible outline I remembered from the original blueprints, a seam in the concrete block, was indeed the hidden vault door. I used the toe of my sensible, leather pump to gently nudge aside a stack of old magazines, revealing a damp patch on the floor, and immediately my senses went on high alert. The dampness wasn't just water. It had a faint metallic odor, like ozone and old pennies. As I got closer, the scraping stopped, replaced by a low, consistent thump-thump-thump, a sound with a distinct, unnatural rhythm, like a machine, or a heart, beating in the silence of the earth. And then a tiny, almost imperceptible sliver of light, not the furnace's pilot light, but a cold, pale blue luminescence, appeared in the mortar gap between two cinder blocks. The blue light, thin as a spider silk, was mesmerizing and deeply, intrinsically wrong. It pulsed, perfectly synchronized with the thump-thump-thump behind the wall, painting the dust motes in the air with a fleeting, ghostly color. My blood, which had been sluggish with cold, now surged with a fresh wave of adrenaline, not panic, but a fierce, predatory focus. I was back in the boardroom, facing a hostile entity, and this time, the stakes were personal. My life, my legacy, and the truth about what Michael and Crystal were truly up to. I pressed my ear against the cold, rough surface of the cinder block, ignoring the immediate shock of the temperature, trying to discern any human sound, any fragment of dialogue that would give me a clue. Nothing. Only the machine-like rhythm and the strange, electric scent. I ran my fingers along the seam where the light was escaping, and I felt it. A perfectly smooth, cold metal plate, seamlessly fitted into the rough textured wall. A clear indication that this was no ordinary masonry. This was a sophisticated, sealed barrier. My memory, sharp as ever, dredged up the details from the proprietary, classified notes I'd compiled on the land acquisition 15 years ago. Whispering Pines was built on the site of a decommissioned research facility, a place the government claimed was a forgotten agricultural testing center. My father, a powerful, quiet man who never trusted the government's explanations, had insisted I buy the land, even though it was ridiculously overpriced. "Millie," he'd said, his voice grave, "you want to own everything they think they've buried. Control the ground, and you control the secrets." Now, standing here, feeling the vibrations of something clearly not agricultural, I knew his paranoia was well-founded. Michael and Crystal, they were merely the greedy, foolish caretakers of a much larger conspiracy. They must have found the activation sequence, maybe a hidden switch or a coded phrase, and, driven by some twisted notion of quick wealth, they'd unwittingly woken the sleeping giant beneath their very feet. The thought made my hands clench into fists. They didn't just disrespect me, they put the entire subdivision, the hundreds of families I was legally and morally responsible for, in danger. I began to methodically search the visible wall around the furnace for any external panel, any junction box that shouldn't be there. My breath held tight in my chest. I knew the facility had to have a primary power override, a manual shutdown designed for emergencies. I hadn't installed it for this house, but for the entire grid. I located a small, almost invisible access panel tucked behind a tangle of copper piping. An old-school rotary lock, 3 digits. I knew the code instantly. It was my father's birthday, the only number he ever trusted. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as I began to turn the dial, click, click, but just as the third number aligned, a sound from upstairs, the sound of the latch on the basement door being violently thrown back, froze me mid-movement, leaving me hunched over the panel, my heart pounding a frantic counter-rhythm to the thump-thump-thump of the blue-lit wall. And I knew, with absolute certainty, they had come back, but this time, the look on Michael's face wouldn't be smug greed, it would be pure, desperate fear. The heavy wooden basement door swung inward with a jarring slam, not revealing Michael or Crystal, but casting a long, skeletal shadow down the concrete stairs that stretched and writhed like a living thing in the sparse light of the single bulb. My hand froze inches from completing the final turn of the rotary lock. My focus instantly shifted from the humming wall to the immediate, tangible threat on the staircase. I saw movement, a shape detaching itself from the gloom, but it wasn't the familiar, bulky silhouette of my son. This figure was leaner, sharper, and moved with a silent, unsettling grace. And then I saw the light glint off something metallic in their hand. My mind processed the scene with terrifying speed. A home invasion? No, the main house alarm, which I had personally designed, was silent. It had to be someone they knew, someone they'd called, or worse, someone they'd let in. A chilling wave of realization washed over me, far colder than the basement air. The argument I'd overheard, Crystal's panicked voice. "You told me it was empty. You said she shut it down years ago, Michael, you promised. It wasn't about an affair or debt. It was about the occupant of the facility, the person or thing that was now beating against the vault door. And this new arrival wasn't a friend. As the figure descended 2 steps further, enough for the dim light to catch their face, my breath caught in my throat, not from fear, but from a devastating, earth-shattering recognition. It was Julian, my eldest son, the one who supposedly died in the plane crash with his father 20 years ago. He was older, his face etched with a harsh, unfamiliar gravity, and the metallic object he carried was a small, military-grade satellite phone. He stopped halfway down the stairs, his eyes, which were once the bright, innocent blue of a summer sky, now flat and cold as polished slate, locking directly onto mine. "Hello, Mother," he said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone devoid of any warmth. Major twist. The plane crash hadn't killed him. It had been a staged disappearance, orchestrated by my husband and an unknown partner, to give Julian a new identity and a new mission, which involved retrieving something my father had secretly hidden in the research facility beneath Whispering Pines. The subdivision wasn't just my property, it was a decades-long clandestine operation, a burial ground for an experimental technology my father believed was too dangerous for the world. And Julian wasn't here to save me. He was here to finish the job Michael and Crystal started, a job they botched because they didn't realize the original vault required 2 key holders, one of whom was still alive, me. His gaze flicked to the access panel I was crouched near, and a flicker of something, not love, but urgent necessity, crossed his face. The override. "Give me the code, Mother. Now." Michael and Crystal weren't smart enough to know what they were unlocking. "You are. Finish your father's work, or everyone on this street dies tonight." The thump 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 from the wall intensified to a frantic, shuddering kaboom, and the sliver of blue light expanded into a blinding fissure as the metal barrier buckled under an internal pressure that promised imminent, catastrophic rupture.